people on today, and I realized it's so. Please continue sharing, everyone. It's always so exciting to see how we have the whole world with us today. So again, welcome everyone. This is the second last day of the series. I can't believe we're already here. The series has been curated by Nork and us. It's part of a broader initiative with thanks to Porticus. And there are 4 pillars to our work. We have systems research, systems investing, systems measurement, systems design and implementation. The series is part of the measurement pillar. As always, opportunity to earn a digital certificate that you can use on LinkedIn and other digital places. If you complete 50% of the work and complete a short survey after the session. And of course, everything is available to you on the website. We know that you've been watching the YouTubes because we see you. And also you can continue the conversation on ECD Connect on connect.ecdan.org after the session as well. The basic format of each masterclass, we do welcomes and introductions, the masterclass teaching itself, the dialogue with the early childhood expert, and then the participant Q&A. So for that, please be sure to make sure you put your Q&A in the Q&A box. You have an opportunity to vote for questions that you find popular. And you can also write in the chat, but make sure you select everyone so that we can all see it. All right. And for those of you who want Spanish translation, with big thank you to UNICEF LACRO, we have Mitzi, our amazing Spanish translator, who's online with us. You can select Spanish. And we have a whole bunch of AI people, AI assistants online. My God. I wonder if we have more AI assistants than actual people. And this is where we are, session number 12. It's so exciting to have one of my favorite systems thinkers online with us, Cynthia Rayner, who's going to be going over the principles and practice of systems change, case studies of systems work. So let me introduce both her and Sharon to you. Cynthia Rayner, she's the adjunct lecturer and senior researcher at the University of Cape Town. She's an independent consultant, researcher, and storyteller, focusing on how organizations and communities work together to shape social systems. She has more than 2 decades of experience working in the nonprofit and corporate sectors, first as management consultant and later in several organizations supporting children and families in South Africa. Her current affiliate includes senior researcher with the Bertha Center of Social Innovation and visiting fellow at the University of Oxford Scholes Center for Social Entrepreneurship. And her book, I hope everyone goes after the session gets it. It's amazing. The Systems Work of Social Change was recently awarded the Alliance for Nonprofit Management's Terry McAdam Book Award for Changing the Way We Think in 2022. And I was actually introduced to Cynthia by Sharon, who was a champion of the book itself that we were reading when we were working together on the research. But Professor Sharon Goldfeld, she's the director of the Center of Community Child Health, Royal Children's Hospital. She's going to be our early childhood expert today, dialoguing with Cynthia. She's a pediatrician, a public health researcher, and policy advisor focusing on child development and health equity. She's the director of the Center of Community Child Health at the Royal Children's Hospital and theme director for population health at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, with a decade of experience in state government as a senior public servant in health and education and an outstanding track record. She has successfully straddled research and policy. Her expertise is highly sought after with appointments to government, expert advisory groups in health, education, and social service departments. With that, I'm so excited to dive into this session, and I hand it over to you, Cynthia.
Thank you so very much, Shikufe, and thank you to the ECDAN team for having me today, and thank you for all of you for showing up specifically on a public holiday. I know it's a public holiday in many places around the world, so I'm so appreciative that we have so many people here. I am going to share my slides and give you a little bit of a taster as to what we're going to be doing today. I'll be speaking to you for about 45 minutes, and we're going to be going through an introduction to complexity, thinking about the way challenges that we face are featured and thinking about why complex problems differ from other types of issues. Then we're going to look at principles and practices of systems work, specifically deep diving into 4 case studies of systems work that are featured in the book that Shikufe mentioned, but also kind of talking through them and thinking about them more deeply. And then I'll leave you with a homework exercise, something that I hope will be helpful. And then most importantly, we'll be able to dialogue with Sharon as well as get questions from all of you, which is really the most important part of this session. So let me go ahead and kick off. I want to give a little bit of background to this research and contextualize it in the experience that I've had over the last 8 years, really spending time with whom I would call systems workers, organizations and founders and leaders and frontline workers around the world who are working to make systems change. And just giving you a little bit of background as to how I got here. So for the last 12 years, I was based in Cape Town, South Africa, and during that time was working in organizations mostly focused on HIV. And during that time, I was seeing a greater interest in the field in understanding a term called systems change. Now, this was over a decade ago. The term systems change wasn't in the lexicon. In fact, it was kind of an elite word. It was something that was being spoken about in funder circles. And many of the practitioners that I was working with were wondering, what is this term? Is this just the latest fad? Is this something that, we're going to be expected to work into our proposals and think about? And really, it has no meaning. It's just kind of the latest fad in the field. And so at that time, I moved from being a practitioner myself into an academic role, writing case studies and doing research at the University of Cape Town at the Bertha Center for Social Innovation. And this term kept coming up, and it was something that kind of wouldn't go away. And we were commissioned at that time by the Schwab Foundation, based in Geneva, to actually conduct case studies of systems change around the world. And when we started doing research on the terminology, we realized that, in fact, this was not just a term, but a concept that we felt had real resonance in practitioner work, but in fact, it wasn't being represented in the way that we felt that practitioners were really undertaking it in their everyday work. So this led to this 8-year journey that I'm speaking about, really to understand from practitioners, primarily in the Global South, what does systems change mean to you? What does the work of changing systems really look like on an everyday practical basis? And how can we take this from being an elite funder-driven term to actually being a term that has resonance, makes sense, and really drives improvement and evolution of work in the field? So that's really the background here. That led to a series of case studies that led to a report. And then most recently, the book that we wrote with my colleague, Francois Bonici, who at the time was founder of and ED of the Bertha Center. We published this book in 2021 to put this work out in the world, mainly trying to represent the work that we felt was truly the day-to-day work. In the process of doing this, we came to kind of a discovery or an interest in what was happening in the field of social change more generally. Like I said, this was a term that felt like it was a fad. It was something that was kind of being resisted to by practitioners, and we felt like we wanted to go kind of all the way back. And we actually did a retrospective of about 200 years of social change making to say, why do these terms keep popping up? Why do we keep coming up with different ways of conceptualizing social change? And really, in those 200 years, what we started to dub the industry of social change really came to the fore for us. We realized that over the course of the last 200 years across world history, this idea of industrialization had really started to impact the way we think about social change. And industry, as we all know, is this idea that we can mass produce goods and services. But really, this had started to be applied somewhere around the post-war period to the field of social change, with this idea that the public, private, and nonprofit sectors are going to exchange resources and, in fact, try and produce social change in a mass way. Our approaches to social change both right and wrong are driven by this industrial mindset. And it is a structure that has been 2 centuries in the making. And it's hard to even talk about systems change and systems work without knowing that that is the paradigm that, unfortunately, to a certain degree, and I'll talk about that, has kind of driven the way we think about social change. The problem really comes to the fore when we realize, and we all know this as having been working in the field, that social challenges are not like industrial problems. We are not residing in a closed system like a factory where we produce things where, raw material can be produced in mass and result in an identical product or service. In fact, what we are working in are very different types of contexts. And the social challenges that we are presented with every day are not like these problems. In fact, what they are is 3 things: complex, scale dependent, and deep. And I'm going to walk through each of those types of features to think about why this industrial mindset often does, and in many cases does, us a disservice. So first, let's talk about complexity. And this is kind of an exercise that for me was really eye-opening, just this idea that we can think about different problems in different ways. So I'm going to walk you through 3 types of challenges, and I'm actually going to ask for some participation here. So, go to the chat box, and what I'm going to do is ask you to think about 3 different types of problems. And the first of those is a problem that, unfortunately, I haven't had recently, but that many of us might undertake, which is baking a cake. So in the chat box, could you tell me what are the things that you would need if you would want to embark on the challenge of baking a cake? What are the supplies that you would need? What are the tools that you might need? What are the things that you would need to bake a cake? And let's get some really good answers on the chat box here. Sugar, yes, thanks, Shikufe. Definitely lots of sugar. Flour, eggs, so great. We need these raw materials. We need ingredients, cream, and we need some tools. Absolutely. And we need a recipe. Now, this is key. We can have something that's going to give us instructions. Okay, now, if we do all of these things, if we follow the recipe, are we going to get a cake? Even if you've never baked a cake before, do you think you could follow the recipe and bake a cake and have a cake that somebody would want to eat? Okay, maybe a box cake, exactly. But do you think you're going, yes, very likely some sort of cake. Most likely, although it might not be good. I think you might be underestimating yourself. So here's what I'd like to say about baking a cake is that this is a type of problem where we've got the ability to have some very clear instructions. It's got a few variables, so we've only got a few ingredients that we need. It doesn't need a huge amount of expertise, although I sense some hesitation in the room. But most importantly, if we put all of these things together and if we put our effort towards it, we know the outcome that we are going to get. We know that we will get a cake that is at least somewhat edible and that probably very many people are going to enjoy. Okay, let's look at a second type of problem. And this is sending a rocket to the moon. Okay, so here's what I'd like everyone to put in the chat box. What are the ingredients, if you will? What are the things that we need? Ruth, my daughter, is currently baking a cake. Excellent, excellent. Okay, but to the rocket. So if we need to make a rocket go to the moon, what do we need? A ton of diplomas. Absolutely. We need engineers. We need specs, we need blueprints, we need professionals, we need technical experts. Okay, we definitely need resources, we need money. Do we need a recipe? What kind of a recipe? Blueprints. It's not going to be just one page. It's definitely going to be boxes of manuals, or now these days, online. Team management, absolutely. We need project coordinators. We need people who are managing across the different teams. So we're going to have specialists, but we need someone who's coordinating across it. Now, if we do everything that is in the manuals or in our online instructions, our blueprints, if we can coordinate all these specialists, if we have enough resources, can we get the rocket to the moon? Maybe. It could still fail. Loads of energy. Okay, I think that if we actually follow, according to NASA, yes. Excellent. So you can see the distinction between baking a cake and sending a rocket to the moon. We've got much more extensive manuals that we need to put forward. It's got a lot more expertise that's needed, but it is reproducible with hard work. So if we really put our efforts to it, if we have all of the pieces, if we separate it into parts and then coordinate, we can get that rocket to the moon. Okay, third type of problem, raising a child. And this is a picture of my daughter here. She was younger then. Tell me about raising a child. Tell me about what kind of ingredients do you need in order to raise a child? What are the things that can give you instruction? What are the things that you need in order to be successful in this challenging endeavor? Patience, hard work, capacity to love, empathize. These are far different than the characteristics that we, or the features and the ingredients that we had for our cake and our rocket. Is there a manual for this? Are there instructions? Are there things that we can follow that we absolutely know will work? There should be. We certainly know that there are books, there are manuals, there are experts, there are people who are definitely trained and skilled in raising a child, but ultimately, we need more. The recipe will not give us everything we need. Do we know what our outcome will be? Is it certain? Is the outcome the same for one child as it is for another? I also have a son. Can I expect that they will become carbon copies of one another? Absolutely not. So this is a completely different type of challenge. I love all of the comments coming through the chat box. As the parent of 3 children, I can tell you that outcomes vary widely. Absolutely. So there is no recipe or formula. That doesn't mean that there's not expertise. That expertise is helpful, but it's insufficient. Our outcomes are unknown, and the success with one does not guarantee the assurance of future success. But, and key to our success is relationships. So the relationships we have with the people who can help us along the way are going to be key to a positive outcome in this challenge of raising a child. So I'm just going to recap here. Really what we've done is go through 3 types of challenges. The first, baking a cake, quite simple. We can have a recipe, fewer variables. We know what we're going to get. The complicated one, a lot more hard work, a lot more expertise, a lot more coordination, but it's knowable. We believe that we can get to that point of putting the rocket on the moon. But that third type of issue, the complex issue, is far different. The way we engage with that complex issue, the resources that we need, and the likelihood of success are entirely different than those first 2 types of problems. This is an exercise that has come from Brenda Zimmerman, and it's certainly been useful to me when thinking about the difference in complex problems versus other types of challenges, particularly those industrial types. And we'll come back to what we can do in these complex environments. So the second feature that I was telling you about is that feature of scale dependent, that feature of scale. And here I want to kind of diverge from industrial problems and show that in the case of scale dependent complex problems, we have cause and effects that are different across large populations than they are across small populations. And in fact, the other feature of this scale dependency is that the problems that we approach that have complexity do not have a stopping point. So we see more of them as we go, and we don't always understand how scale works in these environments. So contrast that with an industrial problem where we know that if we get the formula right, that we can replicate it at a large scale, at a mass scale, and achieve those efficiencies. In these complex adaptive systems in which we are operating, that's not always the case. And a really interesting physicist named Jeffrey West put out a book recently about scale, and he says we don't really fully understand how scale works in complex adaptive systems. We have to work in different ways. And then third, what's the third feature that contrasts the problems that we are facing versus industrial problems? Well, I would point to depth. And depth is kind of this big, all-encompassing word that I use to really respond to these deeply held beliefs, values, assumptions. These are qualities that are extraordinarily hard to shift. They cannot be shifted through industrial modes. And really, we have system failure when we entrench these beliefs and behaviors to the extent that we can't even imagine a different outcome, imagine change. So I want to emphasize as we head into the next phase of the presentation that when we think about complex issues, we really are part of these systems. So as a systems worker, we are actually in the system ourselves. We are changing ourselves as we seek to change. And so we ourselves as operators in the system are maintaining and extending the very things that sometimes are the most problematic. And this is really important. We are not kind of clinicians standing outside manipulating variables in a lab. We are in fact very much a part of the complex systems that we seek to change. Okay, so what do we do? What do we do in these environments where social challenges are not like industrial problems? This industrial mindset that we have inherited, that 200 years of industrialization has brought us to bear on social change making. What do we do in these scenarios where we have complexity, scale dependency, and depth? Well, I think what's exciting about this is that there are historical ways of looking at social change that give us kind of clues to what we can do. We can actually use a lot of the things that we've learned along the way, going back many, many hundreds and thousands of years to make social change. We don't have to start from scratch. And one of the things I like to do in the classes that I teach is really point out that on a sociological basis, we have lots of theories about social change and how it happens. This industrial mode is not the only mode we have to take. And so I like to divide it into two sides, the cultural technical and the conflict political, or in our book, we call it the technical and the transformational. Two ways of thinking about social change that give us kind of an insight into how social change has been done over many, many hundreds of years. But I don't think that gets us exactly to where we need to be. I think really when we think about systems approaches, rather than thinking about them as solely on the technical side, which is sometimes where I think we automatically go, I'd rather think about them as kind of bridging the cultural technical side and the conflict political side. This is a way of kind of bringing to the fore those features of complexity, those features of depth, and those features of dependency, scale dependency, and actually working with them. So what does that mean? It means that we can work inside out, not outside in. And we're going to get into real specific examples of the way this works. We can think of experience, life experience, those relationships that we were talking about when thinking about raising a child. We can think of those as just as important as expertise, as degrees, those degrees that were so important for our rockets. We can think about learning as being the key imperative rather than just focusing on single solutions. Certainly process becomes just as important as the outcomes because of that very nature of being able to see more of the problem as we go. And really thinking about the way we do social change as a truly adaptive effort rather than conclusive. We're not trying to get to one single good answer. In fact, there are many answers, and many of those are going to teach us as we go through the process. The last part before I wrap this up and start to head into the principles and practices is that this brings us to a really important question. And it's probably the question that the industrial mindset has kind of put in the background, kind of tucked under the rug and said, this isn't important. But in fact, it is very important. And once we start to think about systems, we actually start to think about the really important question of who drives change. And this is certainly something that in the last 5-10 years has been coming to the fore. The fact that in certain circumstances, in many circumstances, in that industrial mindset, we have placed the burden or the privilege of change in the hands of elite actors has really done us a complete disservice. And we'll talk about why that's the case. But ultimately, if we're looking to have systems approaches, this question of who becomes the driver of change becomes the really, really critical question. And this was really the question or the piece that came to the fore as we were doing our study across these 8 organizations. So remember at the beginning, I talked about the 8 years of research that we did in order to come to develop these principles and practices. We actually engaged with probably over 100 organizations. So to even just whittle it down to 8 felt like a really excruciating exercise. But these are the organizations that we really called out as practicing systems work around the world. And we'll look at some of these case studies today. But really for them, and when we were doing this deep research with each of these organizations, we realized that, in fact, this question of who should be the change maker, of who should drive change, was really the biggest piece that they were working with. This was where they were truly creating innovative change. They were making a distinct effort to put the change-making hat, or put the role into the hands of those who were closest to the issue itself. So we began to call this actor the primary actor. We didn't want to kind of use words that would put that actor kind of at the bottom or at the ground. Really, they're at the heart. So who is this primary actor? Well, it's different in every single situation, but ultimately what they are tasked with, or what they are able to do, is understand the point of greatest complexity in the system. And one of our case study leaders talked about the fact that for them, for those people living at the point of greatest complexity, in fact, complexity is not so much the issue, it's making day-to-day decisions. And so the ability for organizations to put information and decision-making into the hands of primary actors is truly the best way of driving systemic adaptive change that is going to result in positive outcomes. Okay, so I'm going to shift into, for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to shift into looking at case studies of change. I'll talk through the principles and the practices, but I'll talk specifically about how really practical day-to-day organizations are making this happen on the front lines. So let's start by talking about these principles that we saw across each of these organizations. And again, it goes beyond the 8 that I'll highlight. This was really across many organizations. But really what we saw is their fundamental aim was to build responsive and representative systems. And this is why that term, systems change, was not resonating so much with practitioners, because ultimately that systems change term had this kind of idea of an outside in, of someone from the, top of the pile kind of looking down and saying, this is what needs to happen. But in fact, in the organizations that we studied, that was in fact not the case at all. In fact, what was happening was that it was inside out. It was primary actors really being part of the change making, leading the change making. And the principles that really came to the fore here were 3. The first of those is fostering connection. The second is embracing of context. And the third is reconfiguring power. And so this was what organizations were doing in order to ensure that primary actors were able to make their responses to the complexity in ways that were adaptive and positive. So this responsivity and this representativity was actually the core of what was happening. And just, I'll read a couple of definitions. Just in terms of connection, what we found here was that connection was about creating new relationships that promote continuous learning. So it's a specific type of connection. And this idea of context was that the particular circumstances or conditions that form the geographic instance of a social issue were the actual issues that were being responded to. So not big picture, not global, not even national, but very, very hyper-local. These primary actors living at the point of greatest complexity were able to embrace that context and make decisions based on what was happening on the day-to-day. And then thirdly, the power. Power is such a big topic right now. I would say that 10 years ago, when we started this research, it wasn't so much a topic of conversation, and we had to really talk to these organizations and say, what do you mean by power? And by power, we mean the ability to make decisions, to set agendas, and even more importantly, to create the ideologies that influence others. So really, this is about not just sitting at the table, but also making sure that those ideologies, like this industrial mindset, are shifted. So this reconfiguration of power is a really key one. Okay, and then across these 3 principles, there were several practices that we saw, and there are more than these 4, but the 4 that we wanted to really highlight. The first of these is cultivating collectives. The second is equipping problem solvers. The third is the promotion of platforms. And the fourth is disruption of policies and patterns. And we're going to go into each of these 4 in turn and talk about specific examples. So let's start with the case studies. I think these case studies are going to bring to life these 4 practices in ways that just talking about it really doesn't make them come to life. So in each of these case studies, what I'd like to do is actually start at the surface level and go down and go deeper and deeper into the case study to try and identify what was the deep systems change that this organization was trying to achieve, and then back up, what were the practices and the tactics that allowed them to achieve this. So really, rather than systems change being this kind of big picture thing, we've started to see systems change as the really deep effects. I'm sure that many of you have seen the triangle where it shows kind of the deeper levels, or the iceberg model. This is kind of taking the same approach with case studies and really saying, okay, at the surface level, this is what the organization purports to do, but deeper, 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 what is the real deep systems change that this organization is achieving? So first, looking at that first practice of cultivating collectives. And really, this is, like I said, creating a web of relationships. It's not just any sort of connection. It's specific connections that allow people to stay together while they are learning together. And the 4 tactics that we identified, and we'll talk about a couple of them. The first is building a we, so that's a collective identity. The second is really within that collective identity, shifting oftentimes a very stigmatized identity to one of pride and capacity. Third, hosting havens. So this is a really practical way of creating a safe space where people can exercise those identities and start to translate that into a collective we. And then lastly, pooling, which is a term used by social activists to talk about surfacing emotions, surfacing ideas that are problematic, and trying to undo those ideas in order that you can imagine a way forward into the future. So the practical case study that I'd like to highlight here is an organization called Mothers to Mothers. This is an organization that I know very intimately because I worked for them for several years. They're based in South Africa, but they work across the continent. And what this organization does is actually far broader now than when I worked with them. But at the time, the primary mode of work that they did was bringing peer groups together of women living with HIV, oftentimes pregnant and about to give birth, with women who had already successfully gone through the prevention of mother-to-child transmission protocols and could guide fellow mothers in their own journey. This organization has since expanded their efforts to other areas of maternal and child health, and in fact, more generalized family health. But what were the tactics that we saw them doing? So again, at the surface level, you've got this organization that is working within very limited healthcare infrastructure, really working with this emotional isolation of mothers who are pregnant, living with HIV. And the surface work, so this work that is being done, the work that would be mostly seen by funders and by outsiders, is this employing of peer mentors for women and families operating embedded in clinics. And here, what we saw, we went a little bit deeper, and what we saw that, in fact, what was happening here was not just that work of transferring expertise or information across from woman to woman, but rather it was creating a connection amongst a group of women who have similar life experience. And in fact, that systems work practice of cultivating collectives was really the key to their deeper systems change. Now, that deeper systems change was not just about preventing mother-to-child transmission. That, in fact, was this very surface level work. The deeper systems change was transforming the mental models about healthcare workers, who was a validated, a positive care worker in a clinical setting, to a woman living with HIV. So really taking, like I said, that stigmatized identity and turning it into a point of pride. In the same space, being able to host very safe havens where women can come together and talk about their life experience, pooling those experiences, kind of bringing them to the fore so that they can work with them and actually transform their lives, the lives of their children and their families in the process. So here you can see what I mean about doing deeper systems work, that at the very surface level, quite a simple model, very much working within the current context, but deeper, realizing that in fact it was shifting mental models that was the true systems work of mothers to mothers. Okay, let's move to the second one. I've got 4 of them that we're going to go through. The second is equipping problem solvers, and this kind of relates to both the cultivating collectives, but also to the embracing context principle. So here, what organizations are doing is really building the capacity of change makers to be responsive to that very context. So this isn't big decision makers, policy makers sitting at the very top. This is very much frontline workers, frontline decision makers, families making different decisions because of what they have to hand. And how do organizations do that? So there's 4 tactics here. The first I'll talk about, a really exciting one, is about how to circulate data more rapidly and more quickly through organizations and through the people that can use that data. The second, and really important to that, is being able to use that data. So how do you decentralize decision making? So it's not just decisions being made at the top, but rather decisions being made at the heart. How do those problem solvers get positioned within systems? And then lastly, the sustaining of motivation, which is truly critical. The organizations that were doing this best had real tactics and real programming in place to sustain the motivation of those who are making the decisions, because making decisions is hard, it's fatiguing, and it's something that really needs to be sustained if they're to do it well. So I'd like to talk about an organization called Family Independence Initiative. This organization has actually evolved now as well. It's now Community Independence Initiative, and they are working throughout the world. When we studied them, they were working solely in the United States and mostly within California. This organization puts together groups of families. So families cannot operate in this program alone. They have to come with a group, and they are given the tools and the skills to be able to use financial data from their own lives to make financial decisions for their families. So within a small group of families that get together on a regular basis, they're able to see the decisions that they're making. They're able to report on their data, and they're able to make decisions such as buying a house, getting jobs, helping each other with childcare, all the different things that are needed to make decisions that they want to make for their own lives financially and make those happen. So this was a really exciting case study for us, because we were seeing very tactically, how does an organization actually put families at the heart of decision making with their own data? And we tell a story in the book about one of the employees of FII getting fired because he was helping too much. So in this organization, you are not allowed to help. It is the families who are driving the decision making. The only thing you can do is provide data and tools. And then once that data and tools are being provided, it's up to the families to make their own decisions for how they want to take forward their family finances. So what's the context here? The context here is that families are often cycling in and out of poverty programs. That was kind of their aha moment, was that it wasn't that families were always in poverty. It was that they were cycling in and out. And that actually it was social workers and kind of this embedded belief of being helped rather than helping that was actually causing some of these families to not get the information that they needed. So they created this intervention, if you will, of peer groups for families, but really intervention is the wrong word here. This was really about families forming their own groups and getting the tools and the data that they needed to change their lives. So the principle here is embracing of context, and the practice specifically that we really loved and could see very clearly with this organization was the equipping of problem solvers. The tactics that were really interesting to us were about circulating of data. So every family was able to get a computer. That was the tool that they received. They were able to get internet access, and they were able to input their financial data every month into a very customized platform. That data was then shared back to them on a monthly basis, and across all of the different groups, it was aggregated and shared back to them so they could see how they were making decisions against their peers. They would then work within these groups to be able to make decisions and make goals, and then work with each other to be able to help other families advance their goals. So what was this deep level systems change? I say here, building economies of trust. The idea here is that it wasn't just about lifting families out of poverty. It was about ensuring that families felt the efficacy and the wherewithal to use their own data, that this data belonged to them and that they could use it to make positive decisions for their family. So rather than thinking of themselves as beneficiaries, they now saw themselves in the driver's seat. Okay, practice 3. Practice 3 is this idea of promoting platforms. So interestingly, as we got to this point of seeing organizations that were both creating collectives as well as embracing context through positioning of problem solvers, we started to see that organizations were also sharing at the organizational level, and that in fact, organizations were enabling groups to connect across each other and being able to learn from one another. So this practice is around not promoting platforms, again, that are top down, but rather promoting platforms that are horizontal, where groups can share learnings across their different experiences, their different contexts, and create larger scale action. So the tactics here, linking groups together. Sometimes this is really simple. It's allowing one group to visit with another group. It's making those intentional connections. So a group from one geography will meet with another geography and they'll learn from each other. Second, interestingly enough, a lot of this was enabled by the observing of rituals. So things that might seem kind of fluffy, I will say, but having celebrations, having this kind of common identity across different geographies, we're all in this together. This idea of observing rituals was really key to ensuring that groups could share with one another and learn from one another. Third, really important, is that they can collaborate across these geographies and contexts, but it has to be flexible. So anytime there was kind of this outside in codification, it had to be done with enough flexibility in mind that groups could carry on with their contextual activities. And then last one of my favorites, moving from outrageous to acceptable. So sometimes it was these kind of big ticket, crazy goals, 10 million families by 2010, these kind of big things that would rally the groups together and see themselves as part of something bigger. So the organization I'll talk about here is called Slum Dwellers International, SDI. This is an organization that connects millions of people and small organizations in slum communities around the world together. Again, it takes that stigmatized identity and moves it into a point of pride. So these organizations kind of working together and creating a platform really challenges the notion that slum dwellers cannot make their own decisions for their own communities. And just looking a little bit more deeply, this context is really a context that I think many of us know very well, which in cities around the world, the rise in inequality, the rise in economic growth has created largely informal areas, but oftentimes very much buttressed against high and middle income areas. And in these areas, the conflict between the two can become quite high. So what does SDI do? Well, at the surface, this would look like a big picture advocacy group. So they're using advocacy efforts in order to promote the interests of slum dwellers. But really, this is done in a way that is truly different than a traditional advocacy organization. So I would say that the principle that they truly bridge is this embracing of context, but also the reconfiguration of power. They promote a platform by linking groups together. So they create horizontal connections. They create resources for groups from a certain geographic area to meet with another geographic area. So a group from Cape Town might go visit a group in Nairobi. What happens in those connections? Oftentimes they're just exchanging stories, but those stories are absolutely critical. They're sharing stories of how they have moved into points of making real change, of how they've promoted policies, of how they've created different styles of working with government. And those connections are very, very key because they give them a chance to see and imagine differently in their own contexts. And then enabling of participation, we actually have this diagram in the book. It's kind of an inverted funnel. In SDI, very much the people who would traditionally be at the top are at the bottom. And the people who are typically seen as grassroots are at the top. So they've inverted the traditional organogram so that the people who are really driving change are the slum dwellers themselves. They set the agenda, they set the strategy, and they are the ones that make it happen. Those others are supporting actors, the ones that would traditionally be, quote unquote, the experts. And then what's that deep systems change? Well, I would say it's actually twofold. The first is that they're trying to really impact the political context and change the way slum dwellers are seen, making sure in many cases that slums themselves are revitalized rather than moved, physically moved from space. And then secondly, I would say the really interesting one is around seeing this kind of globalized imagination, allowing slum dwellers from Cape Town to see themselves as very much, coordinated and in collaboration, in solidarity with slum dwellers in Sao Paulo. So this is a truly globalized group thinking of themselves as global activists, which is truly, I think, the systems change that they are trying to achieve. Okay, I'm going to speed myself up and go through the fourth practice, and then we can open it up for conversation. This last practice is around disrupting policies and patterns, and this is really closely linked to that principle of reconfiguring power. This is really about changing the rules, super important to change policy, but at the same time, changing the ways of being. And this is what we really saw as exciting and interesting in the case studies that we were studying, was that many of them had been very successful in challenging policy and changing that policy, but at the same time, they found most success when they were coupling that with a real change in the way those rules were implemented. So policy is only as good as the implementation behind it. So how were they doing that? The first is very traditional activism, but done often in really creative ways. So agitating to include more marginalized groups into participation in policymaking. But then at the same time, advocating for patterns of perpetuity. That's really wordy. I'll talk about how that's really being done at a practical level through the case study. Seeing this at all levels. So not just seeing the macro level of the big policy win. Sure, that's a case for celebration, but it's only so good as the implementation behind it. So really looking at how is that affecting the middle layers of policy making and implementation, and then at the very day-to-day level, how does that impact the change in day-to-day lives? And then iterating between these two. So oftentimes these organizations would go through huge campaigns and achieve this huge policy win. There's a lot of effort going into that. But then behind that or after that, many, many years, often decades of actually implementing that policy and making sure the true letter of the word was being implemented. So the last organization I'll present today is an organization called Nidan. Nidan is an organization working across India with originally street vendors and then more largely now, informal worker groups across the country to really both agitate for these new policies. And these policies are specifically to include informal workers in the decision-making bodies. So in the case of street vendors, ensuring that vendors were actually on the town committees that were making decisions for commercial activity in the city. In addition to that, also really trying to train up and to capacity build those vendors and those informal workers so that that participation looked the way they wanted it to look, so that informal workers themselves could be achieving their own design for change. So I think this is almost my last slide. Here, just looking at Nidan and going really deeply into the systems level work that they are doing, starting at that context, informal work seen as temporary, unlawful, a real mindset that informal work is a scourge to be removed, and really working in that context to, in fact, advance the rights and livelihoods of informal workers through this idea of reconfiguring power and working with policies and patterns. But how do they do that? So they do really classic activism, staging sit-ins, staging hunger strikes, really trying to promote policies that are going to incorporate informal labor into the decision-making structures. But then this idea that beyond that, it's usually a decade, 2 decades of work to make sure that policy actually comes into practice in a way that really truly changes the decision-making structure in that municipality, in that small micro level. And really, what are they trying to do as a deep level of systems change? really create a new understanding and the value for informal work. I remember when they were talking to me about a street vendors fair, where they were promoting this idea of street food as being a true cultural icon of India. And I was trying to understand, why is that an important aspect of their work? And I realized it was because, in fact, by changing the way informal work is seen as something truly valuable and important to the life of the city, they were changing mindsets that, in fact, would revert back to those implementation of policies. So 4 studies of systems work. There are more in the book, and I encourage you to take a look. For us, this is really about bringing to light work that is already being done throughout the world, not seen as new work that needs to be done, but rather lifting up work that is already happening and trying to provide resourcing and policy to make it happen even more. I'd like to leave you with a little bit of homework. I think it would just kind of make this, work come to life in your own work. I think there are probably over 100 systems workers in this room alone. And really, it's about uncovering. So like I said, we were always trying to excavate, go deeper and deeper, and try and find out what is the work that is already being done that is systems level, and how can we enhance that? So here's the homework. It's really about excavating your own system work within your own organization. My first question would be, who are the primary actors in your system? You probably already know who those individuals and or groups are, but really it's finding out, are you centralizing? Are you putting them at the heart of your work? Are they the actors who are truly the ones who are in the decision-making seat? And if not, how can you do more of that? And if they are, how can you emphasize and strengthen and give them an opportunity to do even more? So thinking about your relationships, how can you cultivate collectives, equip problem solvers, promote flat platforms, and disrupt policy and patterns to the extent that these tactics are actually supporting those primary actors to be the primary driver of change. Because truly, when we think about systems, systems are made up of relationships. They are made up of individual decisions that are being made every day. So if we can influence those relationships, influence those decisions, we are often going to create more systems change work than we can by creating this kind of outside-in sort of strategy that ultimately often fails. This work is probably already being done. It's about supporting it even more. And from there, I will stop sharing. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. That was just amazing. And just for the audience's sake, Shikufe is right. I did introduce her to your book. And for the rest of the audience here, sometimes you read books and they're just, quite inaccessible. But the book that Cynthia's co-authored is actually very accessible, and I found it really interesting. And I wonder if I just might reflect back just a little bit into the world that I occupy, and a number of the people online occupy, which is the early childhood development world, and this increasing frustration that I think we all have in our failure to really move the needle for young children, both in terms of the average early childhood development measure, whatever measure you use, but maybe, and sort of something that's more close to my heart, which is the inequities that we have for children and what that means for the children of the world, but what it also actually means for the next generation of the world as well. And one of the challenges that I think we've been trying to grapple with is ECD is not a program. It's not like, right, we'll just get this program right. Well, this is the technical solution, right? We'll just get this program right. We'll scale it and we'll be done. And both my work and your work has really shown that just that single program reflection just doesn't affect outcomes, human outcomes. And for us, those human outcomes are early childhood outcomes, and it doesn't close the gap. And so I wanted to just ask you a question to start with. And I've given Cynthia these questions ahead of time, so they are on note. She was on notice. And I'm going to ask you 2 questions because I think they're really related. The first is, and some of your work is already in that maternal and child area anyway, which is related to early childhood development. But in regard to everything you've talked about, what are the things that you think for many of us online we should take away as lessons for early childhood development specifically? taking into account that early childhood development is a whole range of things and not just a single program. And the second part of it is a question that has come from my own frustration, but I think the frustration of many others, which is, what do we do to accelerate the sort of system change? Are there any kind of bits of everything you've talked about that, you know, you think this is going to be the disruptor, or this is going to be the key thing that's going to allow us to accelerate? And the reason I ask about the acceleration question is that, well, a few things. The main thing is every year, thousands of babies are born into real adversity. And from a child development point of view, we only have a few years to really make the difference we want to make to those children. And I feel a great frustration that we just haven't been able to go fast enough. And it's not about just going fast enough, rolling everybody over, you know, from your point of view, that kind of top-down point of view. But it's not without the top-down point of view, because without that authorising environment, it's also really hard to do systems change. But I guess that my question to you then is twofold. From what you've learned and from what you've been working in, what are the specific lessons for us in early childhood development? And then the second is, do you think there's anything in all of that that could accelerate things? And then I'll reflect back on some of the things we've been doing, because Cynthia and I are going to geek out pretty soon. So hold on to your, whatever you're sitting on or lying on or standing in, because we're going to go for a bit of a ride. Over to you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for teeing that up. You know, it's been interesting in the journey and the past couple of years, really thinking about a lot of this in application. And, you know, in particular, I would say that the area that I'm most interested in going deeper in is that area of embracing context and equipping problem solvers. And I think that has a lot of implication for the ECD sector. I think often, and it might be, actually, Sharon, maybe you could tell me more, and I would be interested. But it does feel to me in some cases that practitioners seem to be focused on one set of problem solvers rather than seeing a holistic whole, seeing all of the different actors that can come together to change the life of a child. And I think in many cases that kind of focus on just one aspect of the system doesn't allow us to see the range of problem solvers that could be kind of deployed or enabled to make a difference in the life of children. And that kind of brings me to that that second question, you know, what is the thing that could really be shifted? You know, you can see from my work, I don't like silver bullets. I think it's kind of all the things all the time. But increasingly, I am really interested and focused on this idea of data democratization. So this idea that, in fact, putting data in the hands of those who can make real use of it on a day-to-day basis can really make a key difference in the way, in accelerating the progress. And I think too often it's held too close to the experts and not put in the hands of decision makers. And in the case of ECD, those decision makers are myriad, and they're all throughout the community. And yet too often certain amounts of data are getting to one aspect, certain amounts of data are getting to others. And this idea of being able to come together and reflect and use that data on a day-to-day basis is really hindered or limited. And so I would say that, you know, if there were one area that I would really love to go deeper in, it would be in this idea of how does data circulate, how is it used, and how can it be put in the hands of many different problem solvers, not just one. So there's no silver bullet. It's not going to just be parents. It's not going to just be clinicians. It's not going to just be teachers. It's not going to just be community workers. It's everyone together. But unfortunately, we're sitting in silos and we're not seeing that data, that important set of stories and numbers come across and allow people to make decisions together. So I don't know, that's probably a big picture answer to a very specific question, but I would love to see that happen more. I would love to know more about how it happens and how it can be done effectively.
I mean, this is where we're going to geek out a bit, everybody. So around the data issue. So for those of you online, one of the things that Shikufe didn't mention, or she mentioned up front about the research work that we've done together, and this has been quite the journey for us, together with Ayeshi Yusufzai from Harvard University, which is trying to look at where there is evidence around the world where systems change has led to a human outcome. And I keep going on about human outcomes because I think systems change leading to systems change probably is insufficient for us to be able to say that's made a difference. I think that's on the causal pathway, but in the end, we really want to know that we've made a difference to the lives of children, and hand on heart know that. And so we did this massive systematic review looking at whether there was systems change anywhere in the world that had actually led to human outcomes. And most of the examples, there were very few, most of the examples were in health, which was kind of interesting for a whole range of things that we can talk about later. But the other is when you started to pick the eyes out of things that made a difference, the issue of data was really prevalent in all of the examples. And in particular, the idea of putting data at the front line, right through to those data being available all the way through the ecosystem in order to be able to focus on people's kind of thinking around specific outcomes and what they were driving to. And I'm sort of increasingly of the view then that if we can't put data in the hands of the frontline stewards of the system, so that is the people right at the front line, that if we don't authorise those people and have the data capability in their hands, that actually it's kind of game over. We'll just all be talking to each other, in 10 years' time. But actually, if we haven't democratised data and putting the data in the hands of the frontline stewards across the kind of ecosystem for children, then it's kind of game over. And we've been doing something called restacking the odds, which is, I think, quite a cool name anyway. But restacking the odds is the idea about what's the kind of stack that we need for children, moving away from silver bullet mentality. And we tried to think about, for young children, what's that kind of stack needed, just using a system lens and service lens. And we absolutely know that services themselves are insufficient, but they're a useful hook, and they're also a multi-billion-dollar investment by almost every government around the world. And we kind of went on this idea of what do you need that's both, this is based on James Heckman's work on the complementarity and continuity of what's needed to actually make a difference to human outcomes. So we picked antenatal care, early childhood education and care in the first 3 years of school, and then targeted nurse home visiting and parenting programs. And when I say this to you, almost everybody around the virtual table here will have at least one, if not all 5 of those things available in almost every community, everywhere, in some shape or form. And I realise in low resource setting, they'll look kind of different. And then we said, okay, what do we need to know about those kind of services? And are there enough of them to serve the community? Are they any good? Because we suffer from the inverse care law, so we often provide the very worst services to those families who most need it. And then do people actually come as a kind of set of ways of putting data into the hands of people? And what we realised was there was almost no data available around that the frontline stewards didn't have the data they needed, or the data capability they needed, or the ideas exactly that you talked about, which is how do you know you're making a difference? What are you going to do tomorrow that's different to today? These are the micro data you talked about. And is that actually is change an improvement? Because you can change things, it doesn't. And so that whole idea then, how do you create an ecosystem that's democratizing data, lifting the frontline stewards, but actually engaging the full ecosystem at the same time? So, and I wondered on your reflections, that to me, it feels like a pooling of all of the examples that you gave about how do we do that in a way that we can create population level change. So taking all of those things, do you have a sense of that? Because your case studies are amazing, but I guess the challenge that I think we're all thinking about is, 2030 isn't very far away. We haven't changed ECD outcomes. Do you think there's something in there that you think we could be really disruptive and go at some level of speed, but without leaving people behind? Which I know is kind of the theory of everything, and almost an esoteric question, but I think these are the questions we should be asking ourselves, and you seem the right person to ask it of.
That's a really big question.
I know. And
But
then we'll make time. I'm keeping an eye on the time because I'll make sure that we then go to the audience and get some of their more specific questions. But I wanted to get big before we get down to the micro.
Well, and you just said this, Sharon, and I think you're right. It kind of cuts across all of the different principles. It's not just one. So you can kind of deep dive into data. But what are we actually saying when we're saying that, data needs to be in the hands of frontline workers? What we're saying is that there's more to that, because data just without the ability to use it is not helpful. And data without being able to share it is also not helpful. So I would say that, kind of putting all three of them together, the kind of question back to this group of experts is, where are the people who have the most insight into what's happening on a day-to-day basis, and how can we connect them to one another, and how can we give them the information that is going to make their day-to-day decisions done with more efficacy, and also with more connection to each other. So that sustaining of motivation that I spoke about is not it's not a simple thing. So you can know what to do, and you can kind of even have the information to know to do it every day. But if you don't feel motivated in that moment to deliver on the information that you have, if you feel tired, or if you also feel as if it doesn't really matter today, I'll do it tomorrow, then you're not going to actually push the needle. So I think everybody feeling that sense of connection to one another, that connection to something bigger, as well as having the information, as well as being able to know that every day counts, is a really, really key feature. It's not sending a rocket to the moon, actually. It's actually
It's much harder.
it's the real day-to-day. I mean, think about that example of raising a child, which is so critical to what we're talking about here. Day in, day out, you have to do the things that you know are going to make a difference without actually knowing your ultimate outcome and what it's going to be like. It's the hardest work in the world. And that's the kind of work that we are asking people to do, is to make decisions based on information that they have, to make connections to others so that they can do it better the next day, and then to sustain that motivation to keep doing it. So when we talk about a system to support all of that, we're talking about something that is far more, I guess, far more malleable, adaptive than anything that we've structured so far. So I know that timeframes are really, really critical. It's important for us to have big goals, but I would say that probably the more interesting thing would be to set kind of small goals and to try and come together regularly to revisit them and really connect with one another. I think that's what keeps people going. It keeps people focused on that kind of North Star goal, but it allows people to keep and sustain that motivation to get there. And like you're saying, if we do already know what it is that we need to do, but it's not happening, that's really the crux of the problem. Then it's more about us as people who want to keep going in and doing it day in and day out, and all of the people around us in the system keeping that motivation. That's really key to success. That's my not easy question, or not easy answer to a really big question.
And if if it was easy, everyone had done it by now. So I think this is really hard. I always really like the rocket analogy, because people say, it's not rocket science, and everyone goes, no, it's so much harder than rocket science.
Exactly.
Because there isn't a blueprint, and because it is driven by humans driving, like real people trying to drive a real system. And that I really like, and I think it's come up in a couple of the chats about this challenge between this intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation.
Yes.
Intrinsically, what do people need to get up every day and do this amazing piece of work? And extrinsically, what's in the system that's going to set up to enable them to do that? And I just want to put one other thing on the table, is that we just have to be careful that we don't put all of the responsibility on the frontline stewards, and not take the responsibility of the sort of bigger actors. Like, one of the issues around poverty is that sometimes you just need to give people more money, not ameliorate the effects of poverty, but actually give people more money So I think there's always that tension, isn't there, between ameliorating the impacts of poverty and just, oh my God, just give people more money and let's not pretend that giving them more services is actually going to address the fundamentals of what the stress is for families when they simply do not have enough money to do what they need with and for their children. So I'm wondering, Shikufe, do you want me to have a look at the questions, or would you like to have a look at the questions so we've got time to look at
we can both do it. So that would be great, Sharon.
Okay, so I was having a look through some of the questions, and one of the things that's come up through a couple of the questions, and then Shikufe, maybe I'll throw to you to someone more specific, so I'm just skimming them, is about the issues of power. And so we've talked about democratizing data, but can you maybe just reflect a bit on these power things from this power issue from the point of view of where does the power need to shift in order for this to happen? And in the real world where a lot of that power isn't there. Like, so how do you get that power shift happening?
So in the example that I spoke about in Nidan, the specific power shift there was trying to actually make space in decision-making bodies at the very local level so that people who were street vendors, informal workers, could sit on those decision-making bodies. So that was a really tactical and practical way of ensuring that that voice of the informal worker was embedded in the decision-making body. And I think that can be applied to many different contexts. So it's really identifying where are the decisions for this particular issue being made, and how can we ensure that the people who are most affected by the issues are actually in those positions of decision making, because we will get very different policies, we will get very different implementation of policies if the people who are actually sitting in those decision making bodies have life experience of the issues at hand. So that would be the really practical level. The other one is more ideological, and this is where I spend a lot of my time thinking about mindsets. You know, where is it that we have mindsets that actually power resides and that we're really resistant to give it up? So within the medical space, we know that people with with expertise, with degrees, are held in quote unquote high esteem, and that prevents oftentimes from the information that they hold, which is very critical, from getting into the hands of people who need to actually make decisions about their lives. So in the case of Mothers to Mothers, for example, you know, the founder of Mothers to Mothers was a medical doctor with a degree from Harvard, and he found in the times that he was sitting with mothers trying to impart the information that he knew was going to change the life outcome of their baby, he wasn't able to communicate in a way that actually made a difference. They would walk away from it and the information would not have been transferred. It wasn't going to make a difference in the way they lived out their lives. Now, replace him with a fellow mom who had already gone through the treatment successfully, and that conversation becomes completely different. It's not only different, but it's done in a way that, you know, Mitch couldn't even conceive of to have that conversation. It wasn't like he could have been trained to do it better, to have that conversation in a better way. He wasn't in the right position to do that conversation. So I think that's sometimes where the power question is not really understood, is that we exercise power by holding information. And when we actually step out of that and say, I'm not the best person to deliver this information, but you are, and you are the person who can deliver it in a way that it can be really powerful, that's a position, putting someone else in a position of power that can change mindsets.
Amazing.
I'm looking in the chat and
so
I'm
many
seeing that
good-
this implies a major ego movement. Yes, 100%. And I love that comment because it does. It implies that we are not the best. We are not always the best people to be in every position, even despite having expertise. So yes, I agree. It does imply a major ego shift, and I think that's a wonderful, wonderful comment there.
And can I just follow up with that, because I think the power shift questions always a really good one. But I'll see if Shikufe wants to read out a question first before I do that, because I want to make sure the audience voice is in here. But I was just going to say, so if I translate that into some of the work that I know many people around the table will be doing, which is to bring the lived experience voice to the table. So the actual people for whom the system impacts on actually come to the table. I think that's where we're heading, because as you say, they bring a very different voice to the decision-making table. And I think that's kind of where we're heading. And for those of you who don't know, that the Sure Start, so Sure Start was this kind of massive policy brought in by the Brown and Blair government in the UK. And Sure Start locals were these kind of centres that were set up in highly disadvantaged areas of London. And I bring this up for a very specific reason. They were extraordinary in that they were designed to be and co-designed with local people and to meet the needs of local people and to deliver on the needs of local people. And when you ask local people what they wanted, they didn't say, I would like evidence-based practitioners to sit in very nice rooms and provide me with their evidence-based practice. They said things like, I would like our community to not have dog poo on the pavement. I would like there to be lighting on our streets. I would like to be able to go into a place that was really welcoming. And you can see the dissonance. This is your Harvard doctor versus asking people. And so when the centres were set up, they did things that met the needs of the families. And yes, behind that, there were other things that were happening because, it turns out that immunising children is still really important. But families didn't say, I want to have my children immunised. So many, many years later, and only a couple of weeks ago, the Institute for Fiscal Studies did an evaluation of Sure Start when it first came out, and this was a multi-billion pound, and found that children who lived and families who lived close to the Sure Start areas had better health outcomes into their later years and better educational outcomes. And I think this goes to the very nub of what you've been talking about, which is the ability to bring the voice of the lived experience to the table and the voice of families to the table, how it fundamentally changes what we do. And that when you actually fundamentally change what you do, you can do it at scale and actually make a difference to outcomes. And that was just a huge disruptor. I mean, it was a very expensive disruptor. And of course, they all got dismantled because everyone went, well, this is what happens, isn't it, when power shifts and then everything goes. Sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I just wanted to add another example, very, very similar example, actually. I've just been doing conversations and interviews with an organization called Smart Start in South Africa. And, in the original design of this, that this organization was rolling out, they were developing playgroups because according to the research and according to the studies, a small dosage was actually really beneficial in promoting good, improved outcomes. And so the model that because it was efficient and because it was going to have, the dosage requirement, they set up initially playgroups. Now, what they didn't realize, or I'm sure that they did, but what kind of came across was that in fact, what families also needed was childcare. And also families themselves prioritized more intensive programs that were 5 days a week. They valued them more. And it wasn't just because of childcare. They also saw that as being more similar to what they saw other families being able to provide. So they said, we don't want just play groups. We don't understand why we would only have a couple of hours a day. We want full 5-day-a-week care. And, kudos to Smart Start because they shifted their model. They changed the model. It's a more expensive model. It's a more intensive model. And, in terms of probably cost benefit outcome, it's not creating the same benefit that they modeled in the early days. But it had a huge impact on their program. And now families are uptaking that program because it aligns to their values and to their needs and their desires. So, similar type of situation. The evidence says this, let's deliver this. Oh, in fact, what families want is this, let's change. And that ability to adapt and change was absolutely critical to Smart Start's continued success.
And I sure hope they're evaluating it because we're desperate for these sorts of evaluations that we can say, this is what happens when you actually deliver what people want and with sufficient intensity to actually make a difference. So I do hope they're evaluating it. Shikufa, are there any other questions? Because we'll just keep yattering on otherwise.
Yeah,
but
no, there's a really good question that I've been wanting. It's actually from a past expert from the series. From Johnny, I think he's a really good question. Someone is in charge of giving money. Those people will, of necessity, have specific objectives that cannot capture all the levers of systems change. So how do you move from having to give money for specific outcomes to promoting systems change? I think that's a brilliant question.
Mm-hmm. It is a brilliant question. And in fact, we take it up in the latter chapters of the book because we talk about kind of the supporting ecosystem for this type of work. And one of the things that we called out was that in many cases, funders are stymieing this ability to do this work, that in fact, a lot of the organizations that we met with would talk about their work in different ways to different funders in order to receive different tranches of funding that were serving basically components of this larger vision. And that was a lot of effort, a lot of rework, a lot of double work. And it was creating, in fact, kind of differing messages to differing audiences. So we lifted up kind of different practices in philanthropy right now that are growing: trust-based philanthropy, systems change-focused philanthropy, things that are trying to remove those restrictions, see the work more holistically, and put more of that, again, same sort of principle, put more of the decision-making effort into the hands of the organizations rather than the funders. Funders are 2 times removed, 3 times removed. You know, this idea that just because they have the money means that they have the expertise or the experience to deliver on it is flawed. So we call that out in the book. And in fact, since we've written the book, I think there has been a much larger call for this more unrestricted funding, more trust-based funding, and I think it's growing. I would, like to add more voices to it because until we shift the way funders see their role to being more of a support rather than, a driver, the better off organizations are going to be at delivering this type of work, which is so fundamental to shifting systems.
And I wonder also what your thoughts are about funders. Oh, sorry, Shikha, you probably don't have the question, but I'll just slip in there. One of the things that funders don't like doing is funding the infrastructure needed to actually drive some of these processes. So if you think about the idea of democratizing data, data doesn't just fluff around in the ether. You actually need technical sort of infrastructure to be able to do that, to be able to give data into the hands of frontline workers who know how to then use the data, visualize the data, use, the kind of digital solutions that many of us just take for granted. To be able to make sort of decisions on a daily basis. And yet, in my experience, and I'm sure many others, it's actually quite hard to get the funding for that infrastructure. And so there's funding for programs, but not funding for the infrastructure across programs that can actually drive things. So I think there's both the money question's a really good one. Where does the money go to whom? And what is the kind of, I guess, who makes the decisions about that? I think that's kind of, it'd be great to be able to disrupt some of the funder thinking as well. Shikuka, sorry, I'm sure you've got this other question.
There's some really good questions, and there is a question from Guy who says, so important, valuable. I work in humanitarian assistance, but working towards more sustainable through a systems approach. But is it possible to apply these principles in fast-paced, short-term interventions?
I think this is a really interesting question and something that someone brought up to me recently, thinking about in the humanitarian space, how these principles have applicability. And I think first, this embracing of context is absolutely critical. And I think that oftentimes kind of blanket solutions are absolutely what's not needed. So if you can think about the humanitarian space as being a system in and of itself, and it kind of, gets deployed in specific instances, I think it probably, according to this person who was speaking to me about the applicability, she was making the case that in fact, it's about overhauling the system of humanitarian assistance overall. So I'm not an expert in this area, but from what I was gleaning from her, a lot of the systems in play already have a lot of that outside in mentality. So how could we even shift the mindsets of the humanitarian assistance space in general? So when I'm talking about that, I'm not talking about specific emergency situations. I'm talking about one step back, which is how does the system itself deploy and what are the ways that it deploys? So that was a really interesting set of conversations that I hope will carry forward because I think that it's a space that's underexplored in particular with this kind of thinking. I want to just, while we're going to the next question, I want to just back up just a little bit to what we were talking about in terms of the infrastructure funding and how that is important. I would even add the importance of it is beyond kind of technical systems and really thinking about the soft systems. So a lot of this work around connecting people together, these horizontal connections, is really difficult to fund for. Many of the organizations that I spoke with were funding it kind of as side programs. You know, they would put their restricted funding towards the things that were laid out, and then they would use their unrestricted funding to do all of this soft systems work, I would say. And it's about making sure that those conduits for the data systems to work, for the technology to work, really kind of grease the wheels. So how do we get people in connection to one another? How do we make those connections happen? How do we ensure that relationships are strong? Those are the kinds of things that if you put that in a funding proposal, oftentimes there's no line item to assign it to, but they're absolutely important. And the organizations saw the value in it, but we're having to fund it out of unrestricted funding. If we can put language to the things that we're talking about, then we can get kind of advocate on our own behalf to funders that this is important work, important systems work that needs to happen. So just wanted to make sure and highlight that.
And of course, a lot of that gets enabled these days through the sort of digital platforms like Facebook, Instagram. Like, it's really interesting to me, the dissonance between this extraordinary transformation our entire country, our entire planet is going through. I was listening to a podcast, and apparently we should all be called now Gen Transformation. And it's the equivalent of discovery of electricity, the internet, and something or other else. Like, it's like this huge transformation. And I guess the question is, how do you harness some of that to do exactly what you're talking about, bringing people together digitally, virtually? Like, we can manage it everywhere, but to your point, no one ever sort of funds that. It somehow happens through some magic sort of process, but you can be quite purposeful about that, and think very cleverly about how we use some of these digital solutions that I think we often forget about, but are things that everybody uses every day, even in low resource settings. There is just these amazing opportunities to use digital solutions. Shikufe, have we got some other questions in there? I know we've only got 2 minutes left, so I don't know if you want to do a wrap up.
We have 2 minutes left, so we do have to wrap it up. But Cynthia, if you have a couple minutes to just stay back and even, I don't know. I mean, there's some amazing questions. Maybe I'll just read them out. They're there. When we discuss about configuring power, how do we maintain a system for accountability, but also respecting their autonomous decisions and agency of practice? Does the systems approach square with results-based monitoring methodologies that is favored by donors? How do you shift broader mindsets to help people see things like ECD programming as a public good, as we do with primary education, for example? And so many more amazing questions.
I love all these questions.
Yeah.
The results-based questions, I mean, actually, it goes back to the accountability question too. I mean, it really depends who's making the decisions as to what results and what numbers. If we are ensuring that people whose lives are actually shifted and changed because of these efforts are included in making those numbers, making those outcomes, making those results-based decisions, then absolutely they become part of the process. Then those numbers are actually meaningful. It's too often, though, that we're holding people accountable to things that are not meaningful in their own lives. And so you know, if something's not meaningful in your own life, don't you rebel against it? Absolutely. So we've got to make sure that people are in the positions to say, this is what I want, this is what I believe is going to be valuable. And then that results-based accountability becomes a natural flow of the system. For the families, for example, at Family Independence Initiative, you know, they were setting their own targets and they were achieving them outsized because they were the results that they wanted for their own families and for their own lives. So I can't emphasize that more. It's whose results are we driving? And, you know, when we hold people accountable, to whom are we, you know, to whose outcomes are we holding them accountable? But these are exciting questions. I would, yes, I could do this all day.
But this has been really amazing, and I know we're right at time. So Shreya, if you want to just put up the slide of the sessions tomorrow, and we can skip everything else because I think people have heard it all. I'm fairly convinced. do the survey, get the certificate, look at the sessions recordings. The sessions for tomorrow. Tomorrow is the last and final day of the Masterclass series. I'm going to miss hanging out with everyone 5 hours a day. But we have exciting sessions. Again, Sharon is going to be with us with Brittany Dernberger to close us off on measuring early childhood systems change, systems level impact framework. And then finally, we have a really exciting treat with David Navarro and John Atkinson on systems leadership. How do we take all this forward collectively together? And David Navarro himself, I mean, he's a pretty well-known global leader, was the special envoy for COVID-19 to the UN Secretary General, and has spent many years shaping the direction of WHO at the highest level. So hope everyone can join us for a big graduation party tomorrow at their last class. And with that, big thank you to the ECTAN team who works behind the scenes, and find everything on the website as always. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good day or evening or night, wherever you are. Thanks, Cynthia, and thank you, Sharon. This was such an exciting session. Thank you so much, both of you.
Okay. Bye, Sharon. Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.